Richard.
Is this natural?
Hey everybody, welcome back to the program. Today we are talking about John Coltrane, particularly this album right here, and I'm joined by two of my good friends, Richard Conti, Tim Despic. Richard, apart from being an awesome dude, he plays saxophone, multi-talented musician, also plays jazz, and Tim is a film composer. And I don't know how many instruments you play, but
a few.
Yeah. And so like I brought these guys here because they know music in terms of like technicality, in terms of like what's going on. They'll probably hear things that I don't hear because I'm just kind of a novice listener. Like I have some music background, but I can't read music anymore. So that's why I brought my friends in here to talk about this newly discovered live recording. You know, my favorite things. I love that track. So it was interesting to listen to the album version and then check out this one, which I think, Tim, you're saying he didn't even realize it was being recorded at the time.
No, he didn't.
Yeah.
The guy who was recording was actually testing out the room for seeing what it would be like to actually do a live recording in there. So we just put one microphone in the room. It was a RCA 77 room mic that he hung from the ceiling. He had a microphone cable going down to the back room where he had a tape deck. And it was really just to see from that one microphone what the reflections and stuff like here. It's just coincidence that it happened to sound perfect. But John Coltrane had no idea this was being recorded.
Right.
They were playing a set. The fact that the people in the background, the room sound of applause and stuff just happened to be enough to hear it between the tracks. You can kind of slightly hear it.
Sure.
Maybe after a solo, there's a bit of applause.
Right.
It wasn't intentional to pick that up. It wasn't intentional that he got the balance right in that as well. But yeah, one microphone.
And I'm sure they did some EQing. I'm sure there was some mastering done.
There would have been for this pressing. There's only so much you could really do though in terms of the separation of the bass and the kick drum, which would be the big thing you'd want to be having control over.
Interesting. Okay.
And that just happened to blend just about right. And that's just freakish amounts of luck.
Is that just because that can overpower a recording?
Well, they're two of the same frequencies that you're competing with each other on certain notes of the bass. You'll be hitting the same part. So
Gotcha.
You wouldn't want things to muddy up there. You'd want to be able to get that separation in the mix, or which is the bit you really want to be feeling at that point. Is it the kick or the bass? Who's taking control? What would then happen if you were close miking that is you'd have control over that. But if it comes to a room, to get the room sound, a lot of room noise, the echo of that would really becoming muddy. Village Gate Room, for what they were doing that night, had the right sound for that performance.
Wow.
Comparing with my favorite things, the studio recording versus this one, you have Eric Dolphy as part of the quintet, and he's playing flute and bass clarinet. This is an atypical arrangement in jazz, even today, right? It's generally you have a monophonic soloist or leader, perhaps, where it's trumpet or sax, and then you have the piano, drums and bass, or instead of piano, maybe guitar. But here, right, you have Coltrane on soprano sax, and he's known for tenor, except for the favorite things, basically. So it would be very odd. In fact, I would say it would still be very odd today. I'm going to go see Jazz Combo, and what's the arrangement? What's the instrumentation? And it's soprano sax, flute, and bass clarinet. That's just a really atypical ensemble, I would say. And what's also strange kind of throughout the album, you have, even though it's Coltrane's gig, right? Dolphy is actually starting off a lot of the tracks with, he's playing the head, the melody. He's taking the first solo a lot of the time, which is, that's interesting too. Generally, you have the leader is taking the first solo, and then it goes from there. And also Elvin Jones, the drummer, he's really going for it in this recording, which is really great. Again, kind of different from the studio recording.
Right, it's much more laid back, it feels like.
Yeah, something subdued, and it could be even the way they mixed it.
Right,
so right, they don't have the option.
Exactly.
You were saying like it's one mic. They don't have the option to kind of mix as they want. You kind of have to take it in that live raw sound. And so in the solos of Eric Dolphy and John Coltrane as well, they're also, it's almost like they're playing shapes as opposed to patterns, or, this is, the improvisation is kind of almost, it's akin to wailing in some parts of it. So again, kind of contrasting between the prior recordings as well.
Right. And so for me, like when I hear the version of My Favorite Things, it sounds like they're really, at least on the solos, it's like they're really like pushing it, and they're like, they're just like going places. Like they're not trying to. I'm not saying that the studio recording was being dumbed down at all, but it definitely felt like they returned to the melody more often. Whereas this, it was almost, I don't even know if they started with it.
I was gonna say, I don't even.
Yeah. I think they just
started improv.
But I don't know if that's because the guy didn't catch the top.
Maybe.
There's a full side on that first one, and there are definitely points where you go past that melody and you think you're into the next track.
Yeah.
10 minutes later, you then hear that little glimpse of the melody again. You say, oh, we're still on side one, track one.
Again, just going back to Eric Dolphy, I almost feel like his influence on Coltrane at this point, I feel like they're feeding off of each other. You have Eric Dolphy kind of going, kind of making these shapes, and then, favorite things and other things. You have Coltrane kind of going like, kind of way up there, know. So I feel like you kind of have this symbiotic thing going on. Also, I might mention like McCoy Tyner, the piano player, right? He's a little bit more in the pocket. This isn't a critical observation, but his is much more in the legacy of maybe jazz improvisation than where you have Eric Dolphy and John Coltrane going, which is a little bit more interesting. Also, it might be interesting to point out, like, why are Eric Dolphy and John Coltrane able to be as free? Well, you have this rhythm section that are laying it down for them. Elvin Jones, he's getting in there, up there with them, but you have the bass and piano that are really they're laying it down and allowing these guys to be able to go where they want.
The foundation.
Foundation, yeah. Yeah, just in context, if you're bringing up the other albums, kind of seeing where we are in his trajectory. So, you have Giant Steps that came out prior to this, and how different this one is, and I think it's just not that much further in time. He's just kind of evolving. You see where jazz is going away from traditional standards that were played prior and more into modal playing, more exploring different areas. On the Kind of Blue album, Coltrane's on that album, but he's playing more clean in a way, to me it sounds like, than this, right? There's some things that are a little bit more guttural, which is that to me that seems, this is a break with something. We're getting into guttural sounds as opposed to like the clean, really quick hard bop that was utilized on prior albums.
And when you say modal, is there a way you can explain that to someone who doesn't quite understand?
A way of maybe describing them is scales, but it's not just about the different keys. It's different positions of how the notes are next to each other. With the half steps would be the best way to explain it. Wouldn't you say you've got two different half steps in each different kind of mode? They really give the character of a different feel. So some have more of a brightness, some have more of a sadness. But the modal thing that's going on here is, in my interpretation of it, is that it's the switching of modes within one solo, which is pretty complicated. Yeah.
Okay.
Again, kind of using just like two chords throughout the entire composition. Again, very different from, you look back to like Charlie Parker in the 40s, and you know, songs like Cherokee where there's a chord every second sometimes, here it's like, you know, in a lot of ways they're kind of unfettered. They're not clamped to, okay, we have to really be in all these chord changes, or we're not going to be playing all these patterns or idioms that are typical in jazz. You know, they're kind of freeing themselves from these constraints a little bit and exploring a little bit more.
As a novice listener, or someone who's like doesn't know how to play music, but wants to get into jazz. I mean, maybe we don't start with this record, but what's something that as a listener, we can kind of like look for to kind of maybe appreciate it more or somehow, you know, get something out of it.
You were talking about how some of the studio recordings might be more accessible to listeners, and that so the freeform might be alienating to some people.
Yeah.
I would say as far as the more freeform stuff goes, this is a better entry point than most of them. Yes, it's more out there than the recordings, but I think it's more accessible than a lot of other ones. So if you want to start off in that direction, this is a good point for it.
Okay.
I think one of the things people could latch onto, specifically with this recording, as like a first time thing, is the drumming. You're going to hear a lot more going on than most studio recordings you hear of other genres as well. They're used to hearing things that are pretty much, most recordings of drums now very often are copied and pasted. They took whatever they played in the verse and just on a computer shoved it in there.
Wow.
Or even looped the whole way through, apart from a few breaks here or there. And like you said about consistency, they're trying to pretty much have the same feel throughout the song on the drums.
Yeah.
This is a good example of how different it can be to that. He keeps everything locked together, but he's going all over the place at the same time. And I think without having to know much about theory, you could just listen to the drums and feel all the different rhithms going on.
If someone wants to get into jazz altogether, I don't know if this would be the best starting point.
Right.
But it is interesting. And what is a great starting point for this is just that if you're a fan of music in general, how, we're talking about the room sound. And for me, this is like one of the best live recordings where it's like, oh, wow, I feel the energy, So if you're a fan of music and you're just maybe if like a recording engineer type person, how does the energy sound in this one? That may be an interesting point of entry for people too.
But you do feel the drums on this one a lot, which is great.
Yeah, and I think that kind of gives it that because the bass drum is loud and the drums are there, and I feel like that is one thing that's hard to match in a live recording. Like when you're live, something you like because you feel that bass drum like in your gut a little bit, and the fact that maybe like the one mic thing was just maybe that's the way to do a live recording because I really feel it like, oh yeah, I feel the energy and like this was live. And I think it is kind of that because that drum is so present in this recording.
Well, it's the same as on When the Levee Breaks with Led Zeppelin. I mean, on the drum kit alone, that was one microphone hanging above this stairwell that went up. They still mic the other instruments, but in that instance, they got that drum kit booming.
Oh, interesting.
But it was about being in the right space for that to work. But in this case, I guess it just happened to capture the drums more than everything else a bit. But it doesn't sound off balance at all when you listen to the record.
Yeah.
But you just feel it a lot.
What do you think made like Coltrane?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Like, what is it? What makes him for you?
For me, maybe he has an intensity about him, and as he got further along, maybe an emotional rawness, but he's had such a long period of just almost immaculate skill in his playing, flawless. So it's an interesting pairing. He's known for innovating so many things, these what they call sheets of sound, which he's been described as. So he's just playing so many notes and so quickly. So there's that aspect. There's the Giant Steps album where he's just having different chord changes that were not used in jazz before and not used in music that much that I can recall before either. And then, again, kind of just his own personal progression. I think all those things combined make him for an interesting player.
I think for me, you take Blue Train behind you and Love Supreme. I think for me, it's the fact that he's made albums within that genre that I find the most listenable because it's pushing the boundary, but it's still not the stuff that's too out there like we were talking with the freeform that's hard to listen to. I think the balance of his is probably some of the best balance. And I've played this album non-stop since 2 weeks ago.
That's
my
amazing.
neighbours must be going mad.
All right. And on that note, thank you again. And thank you all for watching. Really appreciate it. Especially want to thank my members over on Patreon. I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Yeah, so that's the long and skinny of it.
So you're going to edit this down, right?
Yep. Yeah. Totally.
Do you
cut out the fluff.
Yeah.
No.
Do you need some bumpers? Like, hi, I'm Richard Conti, and you're watching Vinyl Rewind. And then I could do that.
Yeah,
you know?
I love it.
Can you keep the bit in where you saw yourself in the camera?
Is this natural?